Hall. I am the education program intern with Trees Atlanta. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and then I will turn it over to the presenters. So just a quick intro here. So welcome to the speaker series. We're talking about shifting mindsets where invasive species are concerned. So we have three awesome people who are going to tell us a little bit about that today. So in case you weren't aware, Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conservation, and education. So our speakers are Jamie Rosenthal, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Roots Down, Sam Cramer, who is the founder of Rethinking Invasive, and T. Pavalny, who is the founder and owner of EcoLogic. So I think most of you guys have already found the chat button, but if you look a little closer, there's also a Q&A button, and that is the preferred method for you guys to go ahead and ask questions, and we will try to answer all of them at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please try and use that, but I'll also be looking at the chat, so if there are any in there, I will try and grab those as well. So we want to know how we can serve you guys best. So after this presentation, probably tomorrow or the next day, we will be sending out an email for feedback, and it will also have the recording of the presentation so you can go back and watch it as many times as you would like. And we would love to hear from you guys so we can know how to improve and make your experience the best it can possibly be. And last but not least, our website is treesatlanta.org, and these are our social medias. We would love for you guys to connect with us and join the community. And without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to our speakers.
So yeah, I'll introduce myself real quick because I'm going to let our other panelists, they're going to run the show, this program. I'm Jamie Rosenthal. I'm with Roots Down, and for those of you who know me, know that I'm really passionate about creating awareness about how our landscapes can be in our communities, what they should look like, and kind of reshifting the paradigm of what landscapes could offer us. More productive urban landscaping in our communities, I think, could actually be a really good vector for fighting climate change and for solving food security issues in our community. And that's one of the core things that Roots Down tries to do. Right now, I'm working directly with DeKalb County and Ted Terry and Commissioner Ted Terry in District 6. And we are working to do asset mapping of all the unused and unproductive landscapes in DeKalb County. And just to kind of tie it in, I've been actually looking at a lot of landscapes lately, and I'm just really impressed with how much space DeKalb County has and to do some stuff with, which is really exciting for opportunities. But also see a lot of room for these kinds of programs and these kinds of ideas. There is tons of invasives all over DeKalb County and a lot of these landscapes. Just all of the favorite ones, all of the rock star ones like privet and mimosa and all the stuff that's just everywhere, all of our landscapes. So I think once you guys see this slideshow, you'll see that they're out there, they're in our landscapes. We're here to try to live with them in the best way we can. So I think it's really interesting talking about this, and it's gonna be a really great program, and I'm super excited for the other panelists. So take it away, guys.
Hey, I'm T. I run EcoLogic. We are a regenerative landscaping company. So a great bulk of our work is invasive removal. And the way that I'm got involved in this conversation with Samantha, who is of Rethinking Invasives. Is invasive or invasive?
Invasive, no S.
Okay. So Rethinking Invasive is that one of the things that I have to deal with doing our work is what happens to all of this biomass? What happens to all of this material? And what does it mean that it is in the places where it is? And how can we have, a kind of open conversation in our culture where we actually address these things and it's not just a drive-by where we don't think about it anymore? So Yes, that's what we do.
Awesome. And I'm Sam. I've started this platform called Rethinking Invasive just this year, so very fresh, to get people having these conversations in more direct and meaningful ways. The main long-term goal is to change our relationship that we have with the environment in general, kind of acknowledging that humans are impactful agents in this climate. We don't exist outside of it. That's a myth that we're taught. And so if in this context, like rethinking the relationship we have with invasives and the language we use around them, because language shapes our behaviors, it shapes our worldview. And the best way to change a relationship to be more intentional is to change the words that we use about it. So we're going to get right into that. All right. And first, I guess, speaking of uses for the biomass, some of the things we'll mention tonight are traditional herbal remedies, which you may do internally or topically. So right off the bat, anything any of us say tonight about putting a plant inside of your body is not the advice of a doctor. We are not diagnosing, we're not prescribing, we're not treating, we're just repeating traditions that have been cultivated for millennium and not trying to give you any sort of professional advice. I just want to make that very clear. I'm sure I'll say it again, maybe 10 times. You are the master of your own health. These are just tips. And this is our loose agenda. I don't know where to put our faces. So we're going to talk about what invasive is. Yeah, go ahead, T.
A great place to start is what an invasive is. Looking at who we have attending today, most of you, not most of you, but some of you I know, and I know that you guys already know what an invasive is. But we're going to go over really like the big difference for me in my work is describing to people what invasive means as opposed to weedy when people are thinking of things growing in a weedy manner, which is to mean that it's a plant that takes over if it's weedy. And so we tend to use that term across the board as a blanket, but just because something might be a bully in the landscape, as those of you who know the Georgia Native Plant Society know Elaine, who's a master of grasses and herbaceous plants, but she likes to describe native plants that grow in a way that outcompete other native plants as bullies. And I would say that's what we're thinking of when we're thinking of a weed or a weedy plant. When we're talking about invasives, we're talking about something very specific, something that doesn't belong in the landscape or the ecology because it was brought over by people for people purposes. And that's really an important distinction to make, is that one of these things is ecocentric and the other one is person-centric. So much of what I do in my work is trying to reveal the perspective that is non-human, that there's a way to think about these things on the level of the trees and the birds, really. So if we're thinking about on their timeline, what's invasive, it's the things that don't fit their habitat, right? The things that are out of place for that habitat and will displace habitat. That is what an invasive is. How do you feel about that definition, Sam?
I thought it was beautiful.
Here's the USDA definition.
Yeah. For those who don't know, the USDA stands for U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're kind of the legislative bureaucratic body behind what we're allowed and not allowed to do as we cultivate the land in this nation. So that's our legal definition.
You want to read it out? I think you should.
Okay. The USDA defines an invasive species as a non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm to human health. So, T got it right. Pass the test.
They still make it about what is going to be about human health, because I would argue that the first signs of this kind of economic and environmental harm actually we don't notice them as humans because we're thinking about bigger things, but we do see the effects in our water systems, especially in our amphibian populations. We have all these indications of what's going to happen to us before they actually start to happen. So
Right, exactly. We only notice when it starts to affect our human lifestyle. And so, yeah, this is kind of what we said our takeaways is that an invasive in this context is new to it's not where it evolved, right? Because we might get into a little like what is native, who defines native? And so in this time, we're talking about where the species evolved and therefore where its competitors evolved and things that regulate it, which make it invasive. So
Absolutely.
what's that next?
Right. So why should we care about invasives? There's always a good place to start when you're trying to have these conversations just out in the world. And not that you should frame it like that, but having these points to make to people is really helpful. Because if it doesn't feel relevant, it's just not going to sink in. So making these things relevant to people's actual lives is really important. Habitat loss is obviously the loss of any areas where we have our flora and fauna, but especially fauna is what we're thinking of for habitat and where we see a lot of biodiversity. So anytime we have an invasive infestation, what they do is outcompete all of those other plants that are able to provide the habitat, like I said before. But as to water and air quality degradation and erosion in soil, those are like the things that I think really speak the most to people when you're trying to explain why this matters, right? Because erosion is the bane of every house owner in a place like Atlanta. It's a hilly topography. The soil here does not hold its integrity very well anyway. So as soon as you have an area where it's been stripped of the kind of biodiversity that's needed in order to hold that topography in place, you're going to have erosion problems. And that speaks again to like the economic impact, because we see the impacts of that on urban infrastructure all the time, right? How many on the side of the roadway, how many retaining walls have you seen that are failing, that need to be repaired? And somebody has to pay for that at some point. And ultimately, the reason why these things happen is because the ecology is no longer functioning the way that it needs to in order to have a bolstered system that can support itself. Right? These are all infrastructural issues, which makes us more susceptible to natural disasters. When we don't have healthy stands of trees, we are more vulnerable to high winds. We're more vulnerable to increased extreme weather, which we all know from what we've been seeing with climate change that we're going to get more and more of that. So, it's in our best interest to preserve these spaces. And then of course, like there's less space that you can use when it's overrun, and it's very expensive over the long term to deal with all of these things. So they cause lots of problems other than just looking ugly and keeping the birds away.
Right, yeah. Excuse me. And then I guess if we're thinking relationally, when you have an invasive species or a target species here, they're also telling you something about the land. Like T mentioned that there's already something amiss with the ecosystem, which is why the erosion walls are failing and things of that nature. So when you have an ecosystem that has full of invasives, what is that invasive telling you? Like in the case of English ivy, yeah, you probably have a problem with erosion. And when you're planning the regeneration, you need to figure that in. And so they always have something to say. You see mimosa. Mimosa is nitrogen fixing and will put stuff back into your soil. So the invasives are communicating with you about the state that was already there. Because frequently they appear in disturbed soils. So it's a place that we've already come and terrorized as people, to be honest. So what are they telling you?
And to that, one of the things we stress in our practice with EcoLogic is we never want to leave the site more disturbed than we found it, if we can. Because what we're doing every time we do that, it's like the soil is like the skin on a body. So if you cut it open in order to get the bad thing out, In this case, you could liken it to cancer, like a tumor. If you're cutting out the tumor, you don't want to leave a gaping wound to make the body totally susceptible to infection or reinfection or getting something else that could be worse. You want to, you know, suture it back up and also make sure that you're actually taking out where you need to. So that was very well said.
Yourself, good job. And something else that invasives do that's maybe less harmful, a lot of times ground cover, like ivy, I keep mentioning ivy, they filter out particulate matter in the air, particularly in Atlanta, where it's a city on cars, there's chemicals everywhere. And yes, trees are good at filtering out air pollution, but because the canopy is above our head, generally, then we're still breathing in the particulates that it's trapping. But ivy low to the ground is holding those chemicals below where we breathe. So also something to keep in mind, invasives do matter because of the incredible harm that they're causing in a lot of ways, but also nothing is so simple, right? There's always a double side. And I think that's our point today too.
Yes. It should always be mentioned that they're still plants. They still do stuff. You know, like a privet, for example, is well loved by deer. And if you have a lot of privet close to where you're growing a garden, you know, if you have an empty lot close by, you will find more often than not, they won't attack your vegetables as much because they do like to eat the privet and the birds like the seeds. So as much as I'm advocating for removal of all of these things, they're, not to quote Jurassic Park, but I'm gonna, nature like it figures out who's gonna work in the puzzle overall. So yeah, absolutely. It's never cut and dry.
Are we ready for the next slide? Or Jamie, do you have something you want to say? You reappeared. Okay.
Who's eating more pasta?
So I created this very intentionally dramatic graphic here to draw attention to the language we use to describe these plants, right? It's very violent in nature. Some may say even xenophobic. It's all about blaming the species for where it originates and very villainizing. And so I can't see the chat because I'm sharing the screen, but I'm sure people would be able to contribute words that I've left out here. I know already that I left out infestation. That's a gruesome one that makes me squirm. So this is intentionally thought-provoking image. And then I had to make myself laugh. Because calling a species an alien outright just seems like comical in some ways. You gotta make light of it. So T, go ahead.
Absolutely. It has struck me before the similarity between the language that we use talking about non-native invasive species and talking about immigrants, immigration. It's very similar. So I think that there's, that speaks to a larger mindset about displacement of blame and responsibility that we have, maybe not just in this country, but kind of as a species. But yeah, like it's really important to remind yourself that this is all like being filtered through a very human lens, and it's really hard to get to that place where you're seeing the thing for what it is on the ground. They are, at the end of the day, they're just plants.
Right. Okay, and this was you.
Yes, so this is going back to why we should care about invasive species, which is essentially because we care about our infrastructure, which are all of the things that make up the systems in place that allow us to live. The definition I have here: everything that provides goods and services essential to enabling, sustaining, or enhancing societal living conditions, right? And I have a little quote by Doug Tallamy because he really is an inspiration for a lot of the work that I do, which is that restoration is an act of indulgence. And I agree. If you approach this work with that mindset, instead of thinking of it as work where we're punishing ourselves and we just have to get through it in order to get to the good thing, that actually, you know, each step along the way is sort of like, it's almost like going to a spa, you know, for your stewardship and your responsibility of your piece of land. You're giving it a spa day every time you do this kind of work, rather than it being like the tedious act of, I just have to get it cleaned out, which I think is how we think about it a lot of the time, especially the ivy, like, let's just get it pulled out. There's so much, there can be so much joy and wonder and fun to doing this kind of work when you really take the time and notice what it is that you're doing. We find so many like cool things on site, and Sam can speak to this because they've worked with me now a little bit, but we're always finding salamanders and all kinds of incredible little flowers that are peeping through those layers that would have been ripped up if we had just been pulling as though we had this mindset of, let's just get all the ivy out of here. So, you know, taking that time and treating it like it's a treat instead of a chore has really paid off for the work that we do. Want to go to the next slide?
Yeah.
And the next slide is just what are the types of infrastructure that I'm actually talking about when I'm talking about green versus ecological infrastructure. So ecological infrastructure provides all of green infrastructure. All green infrastructure relies on ecological infrastructure. And ecological infrastructure can both basically be broken down to biodiversity. If you have biodiversity, if you have habitat, you have a healthy ecological infrastructure. And then for us as humans, all the things that we get out of it and call green infrastructure are the watershed management, the erosion control, the stabilization, the climate stabilization, the pollution filtration. So, you know, trees, water-loving plants especially, all of these things actually filter out the pollutants in our environment, in our surroundings, which is incredibly important. As we know, living in an urban area, the days where it's like the air is shitty, it's like that green infrastructure is essentially not working to compensate for the amount of particulates that we're putting out into the atmosphere. So that's why we care about these things. And then the disaster risk reduction we talked about a little bit, you know, as we have more extreme weather and less of this sort of green infrastructure to protect the buildings and the actual urban infrastructure that we've created, we will see it failing more and more. And we see that in floods. We see that with, again, retaining walls and things like that breaking down. And we see it all over the place. And then health and well-being, which I think gets brushed off a lot. It is proven to be extremely beneficial to people just to be able to see green space and spend time outdoors in a biodiverse habitat in an ecology that is functioning. It calms our neurology. It has a huge effect on depression and anxiety. I can't actually name the names of the studies, but I know that there are numerous because I'm obsessed with this kind of thing. So it's really incredible what it can do for your brain and for your brain chemistry, just to spend time outdoors in spaces that have living organisms. Hearing birds will slow down your heart rate. All of these things, extremely important. And especially, I mean, everybody knows with the pandemic, we've all been having a lot of stress. So I have noticed, me personally, that I'm incredibly blessed because I get to be outside all the time for my job, and just how much lower my level of stress has been compared to my friends who haven't had the opportunity to get outside every day, who've been at home, stuck at home and looking at a screen. Their mental well-being definitely has suffered. So I think we need to stress that a little bit more. Sam, I want to go on.
Yeah, so to tie back into the language and relationships, sorry, my roommate's just distracted me. We talked about the joys of a healthy ecosystem, things that they bring. And so our intention, and I think what brings everyone to this workshop here today, is to reduce harm in our ecosystem, right? We're all here because the topic of invasives is appealing to us. We want to heal. And so in most practices, you're familiar with the catchphrase, do no harm. Medics say it, but we're not doctors. And so,
we're not doctors.
no, but they say this. Do no harm is an ethos that we can live by. And when we're using that language, how are we not propagating harm? And so with the work that I'm doing with Rethinking Invasive, I'm totally not alone in this. The first article, I believe, appeared in 1980s in like green media. Some folks have probably heard of Michael Pollan, really famous author, has a comment on invasives and natives. And so people have been discussing, and hopefully we'll hear from someone on this call as well that's listening, who's doing really great work on this, that we've realized that this is an inadequate way of explaining what's happening in our ecosystem.
Yeah.
So it's lacking context. The word invasive particularly, it only puts emphasis on the plant. And like T said earlier, it's just a plant. Like, they're amazing. It's so cool the kudzu can grow up to 2 feet in a day, but that didn't carry it over the ocean. So how can we shape our framework to include pieces of that in the story? Because all we have is stories, right? And so how did the ecosystem get here? What the heck even makes an ecosystem invadable, right? There must be something setting us up for that. And then, as we talked about with the use of the word native and alien, those words kind of place the blame for the behavior on the plant's geographic location. Where it comes from does not create this issue. And so that language is very isolating. And just lastly, like, you would never talk about an individual like that, particularly with like the work that I do with Jamie and things. We're building community gardens. Frequently those are in abandoned lots and things around a city, which is wrought with these species, full of them. And so you're bringing in a community, you're trying to be an inclusive leader, talking about food justice and getting everybody growing their carrots. And then your first objective is to eradicate the foreigners from the land. Like, how are you not questioning how you're speaking and the effect on that, particularly if you're an organization that's working with refugee gardeners or things of that nature? We're trying to be healers. We're trying to do less harm and build community, right? If we start from a place of isolation, a place of violence, our work is going to be disingenuous.
And it will not be received. You know, if we want to have any sort of impact, you know, you have to understand how this will be heard.
Right.
And how it is heard.
So one comment I do want to make is, you know, it's interesting. I actually, in my language on the farm, running a farm, we had more privet than we did anything growing in the field. And on the edges of my woods, and that's why I got goats. But I would call them opportunistic plants. Like, they're filling a niche that we have left spaces in the landscape, right? Mm-hmm. We have purposefully, or, you know, due to our stomping and tromping the way we do, we left those open areas for these things to fill a niche. And I think, you know, if there's nothing there, and like, I think on one of our walks, Sam, I might have mentioned, you know, to our cohort, like, I remember someone teaching me and saying, fill the niche, bitch. And I'm like, whoa, that's a really good saying. Sorry for the crass language, but I think it's important to know, if we don't fill our niches when we're planting, then the opportunistic plants will move in. But I always kind of tend to think of them as like very opportunistic plants. Like, I have a very big love for bamboo, but not for privet, it's just strange. But yeah, opportunistic plants.
Yeah, that's a good one. The one I'm going with personally recently has been introduced because the center of that discussion is us, humans. We brought it here. Opportunistic, while it's true, I still think kind of like leaves that out, which beautifully brings me to the second column. Thank you, Jamie. So what we can do to improve our language in the future, we're believing, is language that fosters that critical and holistic thinking, right? From start to finish, how did the plant get here? Why? What niche is it filling exactly? Things of that nature. Emphasizing our role in the ecosystem. Like I mentioned in my introduction, humans do not exist outside of the ecosystem. I think it's something we're taught, particularly in Western science, that there's nature and then there's us and we're outside actors. Yeah. And particularly with this language, and then as with ecological remediation, if we continue that false dichotomy, we're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Going in and, like T alluded to, like tearing up the landscape. You miss the salamanders, you miss the beautiful things. And frequently you're adding chemicals into the equation, which we'll talk about. Sometimes that's necessary, but T's whole business runs without it. And so there are ways in which we can navigate this sphere without just propagating the systems from before, like I mentioned. And so it's, again, language like opportunistic, introduced. I've heard one from a peer in this work, uninvited guest. Really love that one. It's one of my favorites. So there's just so many more dynamic and creative ways we can explain this situation.
It might be a overstaying guest, because the thing is that they were invited. They were very much invited, but it's like they've outlived their welcome.
That's true. Or they went into parts of the house you did not want them in. Which actually you beautifully tied in also achievable goals. Because like T just mentioned, they were brought here intentionally. Most of these species as exotic ornamentals in the 1800s. If we haven't eradicated them by now, are we really going to be able to achieve that at all? So if our main objective becomes cultivating an intentional healing relationship with the land and stop using these frameworks that are so human-centric, I think that seems a little more tangible to me than totally eliminating privet from the South. Like, that's not going to happen. Well, maybe I'm saying something controversial.
I don't think so. I mean, I am kind of a pessimist, but I couldn't be completely a pessimist to do the work that I do. So there's a part of me that believes we're having some sort of important impact. But, you know, anybody would tell you who does privet removal without chemicals will tell you that it's never like a first pass, one and done type of thing. And none of this ever is. It's never a one and done. It's just, you have to keep chipping at it, which is, you know, why you need to reframe how you think about it instead of it being a burden and a chore. It needs to just be, this is something that we do as a society on the weekends or whenever, because we enjoy it on some level.
Yeah, it's an act of reciprocity. You're giving to the earth when it gets back to you. I think that makes a lot of sense.
So this is just some examples of what, you know, when you regenerate an area, what it can be. I found this image of a rain garden in Duluth, which I thought was real cute. We have a bunch of pollinator species, which you see a lot in rain gardens. But, you know, all I'm trying to display here is that you get a lot more exciting birds, and you get a lot more exciting plants if you start thinking about things as in terms of biodiversity, instead of what'll grow fast, what'll create a barrier, and what's just going to fill in space. You know, we can really start to take advantage of these spaces that have been really left empty, especially in the lawn spots. It's not very big. I would have liked if their rain garden was bigger, but it's a start.
Thanks.
Next. So I do make a distinction between restoration and regeneration. And it's not agreed upon in the field, but I just want to make note of it for this, because we've been talking about it, and why it is that I keep using the word regeneration as opposed to restoration. So funnily enough, I didn't know Eli was going to be here, but I make reference to Fernbank Forest here. So restoration is when we're talking about bringing a landscape back to how it was before people ever touched it. And that goes back to what Sam was saying about what, like what is it that we can actually achieve? And how can we start to think about ourselves as an integral part of the landscape and the ecology, instead of even having this idealized view that there is a situation in which people haven't touched the landscape at all. Because even before, so what restoration is referring to is pre-industrialized society as far as who has touched the landscape, because we all know that Native peoples have been, and Indigenous peoples have been working in these landscapes, have been a part of this ecology for a very long time, but we don't consider that human impacted landscape. So it's really just like the type of human impact that does the sort of modern building that we see today, where we're raising down, we're creating new topography, we're doing grading, and we're basically ignoring what was there. The restoration, a great example of where restoration can happen is a place like Fernbank Forest, where we literally have a piece of forest the way that it has been for the most part for hundreds of years, because those trees, those soils are still intact. And that's very important, because all of the things that are restoring in that habitat are coming from the place. We're growing the restoration from the actual spot. So all of the resources that Fernbank needs in order to be restored are already on site. It already has the seed bank. It mostly just has a suppression and invasive problem. What we really need in most places around Atlanta and in urban landscapes across the country and across the world is regeneration, where there's been so much disruption that there isn't anything for us to work with at all. So we would have to take things from offsite in order to ameliorate the landscape. And that's what ex situ as opposed to in situ refers to. So there's, as far as I see it, there's kind of two ways that regeneration can break down into. You have new wild spaces that you are creating with the intention of them being wilded. And then you have integrated ecological infrastructure in your urban landscape. So that's your bioswales, your rain gardens, all of that kind of thing, as opposed to a new forest or a new wetland. And that is regeneration and reforestation, or restoration.
Some birds.
And more birds. More things that we can see if we regenerate. Yes, so regeneration, it's important to note that it is site specific, and reading the landscape is something that I think we should all become familiar with just as human beings. But I love what Sam was saying about what the invasive species are telling you about the site where you are, because no two invasive problems or invasive species problems on anywhere in the city are going to be exactly the same and require exactly the same approach. So actually taking account of everything that's going on, where it is, why it might be there, and what that might tell you about the history of the land that you're working with is very helpful, and will ultimately inform a better plan for the future if you're trying to regenerate that piece of land. So that encourages the self-regulation, and that's why it takes so long, is because we're always checking in, we're always making sure we know what's going on, and that if anything changes, we can have the opportunity to actually keep up with it. Instead of just like being like, we're going to install this and see what happens.
And never come back again.
Right. Which we've all seen those fail, where it's just like a complete, install in an area where there wasn't anything, instead of doing it in a gradual way, and then like half of that plant material dies. And you're like, was that really better than what was there before? Because at least then there was a little bit of biodiversity. Yes, and I do also like to stress that we're going for management as opposed to maintenance. We don't ever want the landscape to stay exactly the same. Really want to steer ourselves away from this idea that like we're going to maintain, we're going to keep it the way that it was, we're going to make it conform to some sort of shape that doesn't allow room for evolution and growth, because that is just not how nature works. So if we fight that, we will fail.
And language matters.
Yeah. Yes, these words matter. This is really like, I thought we decided to skip over these.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we can skip over these. We'll talk about it another time.
Well, yeah. Again, reminding everyone, there's no medical professionals in this room. I started with this because I know that Streisand has a lot of opinions about mimosa. This is Alabasia julibrissin, mimosa. In traditional Chinese medicine, its name translates to collective happiness bark, which I think sounds pretty appealing. So this is traditionally used as a mental health herb, both the flower and the bark. As soon as I see this blossom, it blossoms in this area from roughly May to July. And the flowers are used as a very uplifting mental health tonic. There's a lot of energy there and vibrancy, while the bark is a little more grounding in energy. Both will make you feel a lot better. It's one of my favorite herbs to use. It's very tasty and just a delight. And one of the things I also want to make as a general point with invasive species medicine is that, one, any plant that is capable of spreading in such a fast and rapid way must be made of something strong and sturdy, right? This plant has a lot of heart, a lot of resiliency, and it makes a logical jump to me that it would be powerful medicine. So always thinking about what things have to offer, aside from the ways in which it may be disserving your ecosystem and humanity. It's made of powerful stuff, so something to consider. And then in a world that is framed at least with scarcity, when you have an invasive plant medicine, it's pretty guilt-free harvesting. You can take as much as you want, share with your friends, make mimosa tea for everybody. So I think that's also something super important to mention about the uses of invasives in processing, whether it's using your bamboo for crafts and tools, and bamboo, when you heat it up to a certain temperature, becomes watertight. And T is actually just talking about using that as irrigation with EcoLogic, which would be incredible. So there's always ways, that's what we're sort of shifting our focus to now. It's like how to use specific species for other things once you cut them. So T, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Well, it's been whenever to reuse everything, if not everything, most of everything that we're taking out of a landscape. A lot of the time that requires some sort of preparation, because something like privet needs to die off entirely before we can even consider doing anything with that wood. Its potential for resprout is so high and incredible. And I completely agree. You do have to kind of admire the tenacity of these plants. Sometimes I find privet growing, in ways where I'm just like, God, really? Yes. Wow. Okay, I guess you did it. You made it work. You could do that. But really, there's a way to rethink these things instead of it just being trash, for sure. I have a friend who he did the outdoor sculptures at Fernbank Forest for the Wild Woods. His name is JD Koth. And he did those large outdoor sculptures that kind of look like wicker. What it is woven privet that had been harvested out of empty lots, and some of it actually came from some of our sites. So I've always been trying to like brainstorm ideas with my community and my network of ways that we can actually integrate this stuff back into the system so it's not waste material. Like who do we know that weaves baskets? Why can't they just start using our English ivy vines? Who who was making outdoor sculptures aside from JD. And beyond that, just figure out ways to use them on your own site has been really eye-opening, because all this wood is building material. You know, when we're taking down trees and privet and stuff, it's essentially building material for free, if you want to think of it that way. So you have hugel bed material at the very least that it could go into a project instead of getting picked up by the trash truck, which I think is probably the worst thing we could do. put it in the landfill. And I know a lot of foragers use the invasive plants that we have around here. Like chickweed is edible. You can make pesto. You can get berries off of Elaeagnus, as edible as it is. Not to say like you definitely should never ever plant any of these things, but instead of just ripping them out of the ground, throwing them in the trash, like it's material. It all has qualities that if we're a little bit more creative in our thinking, we can do stuff with.
Exactly. It's not just a binary of, oh, it exists, now it doesn't exist. Like there's a legacy, energy went into it, and you'll use energy to dispose of it as well. So might as well harvest it. And then another one.
Begonia berries.
Also known as Oregon grape. Some people enjoy the taste of the grape. I'm not one of them. But similar to a holly, if you encounter this in a landscape, it will scratch you. That's very, very sharp leaves. And what's revered as the medicinal quality here is when you break a piece of the wood, the yellow compound called berberine, that's an alkaloid. Yeah, maybe you're reacting because it stains everything.
No, it's so beautiful to me. When they're making new shoots in the spring, that lemony, yellowy green is so intense. It's almost neon. I've never seen another color in nature like it.
Awesome. So that's berberine. It's the same chemical that's found in golden seal, which maybe folks are familiar with that one as a more popular herbal medicine on the shelf. But you probably have it growing in your backyard. And so that's an antimicrobial, topically and internally is used traditionally for medicine to fight infection. So while you're removing it, and then with mimosa, you would need to be more strategic and harvest it while it's in flower. Since you're using the root and the bark here, you can take it whenever, tincture it or what have you, and you've got medicine all year. I would not recommend a tea for this one. It's incredibly bitter. But those are just some suggestions on 2 common ones. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if people would like. I just didn't put a lot. I could talk about herbs for hours, so I only did.
We have some Q&A.
Oh, I can't look at it because I'm sharing my screen.
We already have some cues.
So I guess not to be all doom and gloom or emphasis on language, I wanted to end with some things people can do. So Georgia is one of the only states in the country, I believe there's 4, that don't prohibit the sale of these species in landscape supply stores. So you can go to Home Depot and you can buy English ivy. I've yet to see someone try to sell kudzu, but maybe they would. And things like Elaeagnus. I actually have a friend that worked for a landscaping company that just planted some the other day.
Yeah, kudzu's not banned.
I can neither confirm or deny that specific species, but invasives in general are still legal to sell here. And so if you have a lot of feelings about this work, but maybe don't have access to land to remediate yourself, call your state senator, call Home Depot and complain. Use your dollar purchasing power as activism, because there is something you can do aside from the manual labor as well.
Yeah, definitely. There are more and more native nurseries popping up all the time. I just saw one that's only a few months old that just opened in Decatur. So people are trying to make this flora available to us. And if we support these people, we'll get more of it. And of course, I'm going to plug the GNPS because I volunteer with them, but support the Georgia Native Plant Society. They do terrific work, and they're really You know, you can get a lot of plant material from them through their plant sales, which they do biannually, I believe.
Awesome. And then, as we talked about and could talk about, continue, keep using language that is intentional and showcases everything that got us into the situation we're in, and then what we want to do about it. And I put an asterisk here because there's going to be a separate slide about this discussion that's coming up. But there's a lot of folks, like I mentioned, who are really invested in this work and bringing justice into all aspects of community organizing. And I think getting people engaged about plants and the world around us is community organizing. It is justice work, and access to green space is all about being inclusive and bringing everyone along with the ride. And so hopefully shortly you'll hear from Danielle to talk about the work that she's doing. But so keep talking about it, keep talking about that language. Use words like Jamie said, like opportunistic instead. People use volunteer. There are other ways we can describe these things that don't exclude people from the conversation. And then get creative, talk to your neighbors. Yeah, T, were you gonna say something?
Oh no, I'm just agreeing with you.
Utilize what's harvested. We talk about that pretty extensively already. Understand and slow and prevent the spread. So say if your neighbor has an andina that they really love, they think it's so beautiful, and they won't let you convince them to remove it, perhaps just when the berries are up, ask them if you can cut the berries off. There are other ways in which you can prevent the spread of this, and then also cultivate a relationship with your neighbor, their yard, the plant. There are so many ways.
And to the berry, because people also like the name of the berries since they're so red. If you explain to people that it's having a direct negative impact on something that they care about, in this case songbirds, you're like, you know, these berries contain cyanide, and it builds up in the bird systems over time, and it will end up killing them. So if we just get rid of that one thing, we can prevent that from happening. You'll have a lot more success than being like, those berries are bad, we need to get rid of them.
Right.
It's just like anything else. Try and meet people where they're at when you're having these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Understand their context, and like, we can't all be zealots about it.
Right. And then lastly, Jamie is beautifully wearing this shirt right now. But a lot of times when like T and I are out in the forest, things we're pulling up are ornamental grasses that people are planting all over. And so also challenge the notion that lawns are natural and native and not invasive. So Jamie, you passing that one over to you.
Yeah, my arch rival enemy is the common lawn. I just think there's a lot of resources used to make your lawn green and beautiful, and I think it's just like it's kind of gross. And I think we can like definitely shift that mindset. And I tell people too, like, I am not anti-lawn, right? In the fact that like green spaces are important for us to play balls and hang out and have picnics, but it doesn't need to be like Bermuda grass. It doesn't need to be some of the grasses and things that we use that are extremely invasive. It could be a very great eco-fescue, I think is wonderful. Mixed lawns with, I mean, love your weeds. My God, like people are so obsessed over pulling weeds in their yard. I think the common story I use for Grow Don't Mow is like the opportunity that I saw in my neighborhood where this guy was bent down in his yard, the bucket in the sea of grass in the front yard. They never probably play ball or spend any time with. And his boy with like a sour face on is pulling weeds with his dad, like little tiny weeds out of the grass, like other kind of grass out of the grass, like creating this monoculture with his father. And that was the bonding moment. It was like, man, plant a fruit tree and take away 20% of your grass. And yeah, so the Grow Don't Mow campaign is just a fun way to promote like getting rid of some of your lawn that you don't use and making better green spaces, more ecologically friendly green spaces. And I could definitely later, if you guys have any questions, definitely talk more about those processes. But yeah.
Oh, I just saw that. Lawns are the pre-revolutionary French aristocrat. Yes, it is. It is. If you want to talk about signaling, lawns are what that come from. monetary signaling. So I actually think it was the English who popularized it, but having the large estate with the large open area that was non-productive when it was is a signal to your neighbors that, hey, look, I have so much land and I'm so rich that I don't need this land to do anything for me. It doesn't have to make wood. It doesn't have to make food. It doesn't even support my sheep or my cows. It's just empty. So it's very much a like a fuck you to nature and like a, hey, how cool I am to your neighbors.
Yeah, and ironically, a lot of the invasive we have now were brought over for the same reason, to be
Yes.
ornamentals for wealthy folks' yards, and to prove that they could make this new landscape that they're actively colonizing look like places that they've already colonized in the past. So it's all performative in nature, and we're just dealing with the consequences.
And specifically the Chinese and the Japanese ornamentals that we see so common, the reason why we have so much Asian introduced species is because it was fashionable. Orientalism was really, really popular in the mid 1800s. So if you had a Chinese inspired or Japanese inspired garden, you were hot shit.
Yeah,
All right,
and
we only have a few minutes left. So
okay.
do you guys want to answer some questions we have here?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you guys kind of touched on this one a little, so we'll do this one first. Someone says Nandina and Mahonia do not really take over, so why are they bad? Do they really grow enough to displace habitat in a healthy forest?
The answer is yes. They do. They will outcompete other mid-story, more desirable plants that provide more function than they actually do. So really the idea is it's not that they're like completely taking over and invading the way that we think of something like privet or kudzu doing. It's that they are displacing other plants that could be in that niche that would also be just as sparse as Mahonia or Nandina is. And they have less value to the overall ecology. So
I mean, if you really like it, put it in a pot, put it in a pot.
Yeah. And I also I don't have a problem with these things being in your very manicured area. When it becomes problematic is that it spreads to those areas that we want to be more wild and more habitat driven. They do have a horrible tendency to volunteer in those areas. So, yep.
Awesome. All right, next question. We'll go back up here to the top. It says, I'm removing privet from my woodland and cherry laurel is volunteering in. Is cherry laurel invasive too? Does it have benefits or harms compared to the privet? I'm here to learn what to plant where the privets once were. And then further down, they said, by the way, I'm removing the privet by hand without chemicals.
Bravo. I'm very proud of you, anonymous attendee. Laurel cherry isn't strictly invasive, but it's the type of thing that you're going to take out because it grows in such a manner that you're not going to be able to get the biodiversity that you want if you just let it volunteer the way that it does. So that's something that I would qualify as that's a bully, right? It's more native to the coastal plains of Georgia. That's where we want to see more of it. It tends to be up here because it gets planted as an ornamental. So it's kind of here because of us in the way that we talked about introduced species. And it will take over a whole area because it's very volunteering. So if you want that biodiversity, yeah, you need to keep it under control.
All right, next question. While invasives do easily take over open niches, many of these species don't discriminate and actively invade intact / old / healthy ecosystems as well. So how do you balance that with your explanation of invasives simply taking advantage of open spaces?
I feel like that was directed at you, Jamie.
So what is the question there? I'm trying to decipher what the question is there. Yeah, they they're opportunistic, so they fill a niche, right? I think we just need to be quicker to the, like, for me, like it's land management. It's just land management. It's proper land management. If we can, like, if we're doing a big clearing project, if we can go in, and for me, I'm a big advocate of foodscapes. I'm a big advocate. You know what? Everyone here, and I'll say everyone here, I guarantee you eats chocolate and coffee or other things, kale, other things, right? So y'all do it. Everyone does it. So if we're all like going to be one of those people to say we're only planting natives and we're only planting natives, I'm like, well, we're destroying other ecosystems around the world to get the food product that we want, right? Like, it's good to plant some food. I think that there's some really great opportunistic plants that are not native that can fill the niches really, really easily, like, you know, Mediterranean herbs and all that kind of stuff for ground cover. So I like to just promote, like, what is useful in our environment. So I think, like, to that point, yes, invasives, they do invade the open spaces first. But I can guarantee you that if you leave them alone, they will invade old growth forests. Yeah, they will go everywhere. So it's just getting ahead of it.
It's not a full picture to call them opportunistic, which is where I would like make the argument with you, Jamie. So that, like, yes, they're opportunistic, but so are so many of the plants that I actually want to encourage.
So is the coronavirus.
Right, exactly. All these natural things.
Yeah.
But really what it is when they start to displace other habitats and plants in ecology. And you do see that with the things that I'm defining as invasive plants, which is why I wouldn't necessarily just call them opportunistic. They're more than that. They're like uber opportunistic. They're like Superman opportunistic in some situations, just because, like, the native ecology wasn't ever equipped to have to deal with the way that these types of plants grow. So that web was never going to, like, balance out the way privet grows. There's not really anything that can compete quite on that level. So
and this kind of ties back into the whole framework thing. And, like, I see Danielle mentioning this in the chat, like, this conversation is so the plants as the main actors, right? So what else brought us here? Like, yes, maybe privet will always do the privet thing in this ecosystem because no competitors evolved in this ecosystem versus where it's native to. But so what else can we do? It's not, the privet isn't the only actor, the only thing with agency here. Frankly, it probably has less agency than we do, right? But so I think, yes, while we've created a system that allows for this species to infiltrate the old growth forest, how do we change the whole system so we're not just creating this opportunity again for it to be opportunistic? Because, yeah, the plant's going to do what the plant's going to do. The larger issue here is our human destruction of the environment around us, I think.
Yeah.
I hope that answered the question.
Yes, Eli actually went down and said, cool, yeah, pretty much nailed it. So you guys, I guess, answered it well. So the next question, do you have recommendations for foraging workshops in Atlanta or Georgia as a whole?
I actually have a friend who runs some foraging workshops around the Atlanta area. His name is Josh Wayne. You can find him on Instagram. His handle is @health, love and empathy. I'll put it in the chat. Let me look it up. Yeah.
And I am a crew member of Herbalista Free Clinic, and we do monthly plant walks, talking about forageable edibles, forageable medicinals, and just getting to know the local ecosystem. Like, just a few days ago, we had one in Chosewood Park. I'm unfamiliar with the next one is. Maybe one of my friends will put it in the chat. But we do that once a month as well.
Is Herbalista just @Herbalista?
I believe it's Herbus on Instagram because our mobile clinic runs out of a VW wagon. Bus. Thank you.
I'm going to grab one in the chat right here so that I don't forget it. But they want to know, how do you all feel about earthworms and bees?
What do you mean by?
Stingy and slimy?
So I have lots of feelings about earthworms, just to put that out there. Because in the past year, uh, we've discovered that there's an invasive worm that we had no, I mean, like I had no concept of until we started doing all this work. Right. So actually, in all of my research in doing this, there are actually some native earthworms, but most of what we see, most of the worms that we see are non-native earthworms, and they are one of 3 species of what is colloquially called a jumping worm. These jumping worms come from China, most of them. And the reason they were brought over is because they wriggle very, very hard, very aggressively. And so they're great at very, very quickly breaking down the top layer of detritus. And they're great for fishing. And that turns out that that's the 2 ways that they got out into our environment, was people using them for vermiculture and compost, and also to catch fish. And they got free like that. So why this is a thing to care about? Well, it turns out that the jumping worms are doing such a good job of breaking down the top layer of soil and all of the cellulose in our leaves and sticks, that our large trees no longer have anything to hold on to. And so we're starting to see more tree fall in these areas. Now, I'm amazed that this isn't something that's getting talked about with the DNR in Georgia, given that I've, have already seen tremendous signs of this kind of thing happening. But if you do your own research, you will find that the Wisconsin DNR and the Minnesota DNR are taking it very, very seriously, because they've been having tremendous problems with this sort of thing. And it's our theory at EcoLogic. One of my crew members is really into the worms and has been spending a lot of time doing this kind of research. What they have discovered is that, well, since the northern United States didn't have a native population of earthworms to begin with, all of the earthworms in the most northern United States were wiped out with the last ice age. So there were no native occurring species of earthworm. They just noticed that all of these worms were suddenly appearing in the landscape. Whereas down here in Georgia, we do have quite a few native earthworms that could be mistaken for jumping worms if you don't know what you're looking for. So like those big night crawlers, those big like chonky, thick ones, those are native. We actually have one in the Piedmont that glows in the dark that is bioluminescent. It's a small endemic population and like is only this one little county. But most of what you see are non-native earthworms. And I'm, my feelings toward them is that they're terrible, but I don't really know what to do about it, because the most that we can do, that I can see, is just to remove them. I don't want to poison the whole hillside and the whole landscape in order to potentially kill these things off. I think that would be a huge mistake, and I don't think it would be very effective anyway. So at this point, it just is what it is. And sort of same with the honeybees. I mean, like, I think they're probably doing, the honeybees especially are probably doing more good than harm at this point. We know that most of the pollination that happens out in the wild is happening with the more solitary bees anyway. So if we can like try and bolster those populations too, that would be cool. But the honeybees aren't really hurting anything. I don't think
The honeybees have a good PR.
I don't think they're displacing anything, because they're like, they move with their honeybee home. But I don't know enough I'm not a honeybee expert, so I don't know enough about it to make that determination.
I mean, in all the research I've done with honeybees, and it's just like we get something, the things we get something from, we're more interested in. And that's just like our human nature, The plants that we've cultivated over time, right, are the ones that have survived, like in the forest, if we like spent more time cultivating something. And honeybees are the same thing. Like they have evolved with us. We have carried them around. I think that they get like I said, they have a really good PR company behind them, like Save the Bees, and everyone immediately is like, oh, get a hive in your backyard. We're, you know, I always tell people we're actually talking about the like native bees, you know, the ones that are doing the work, and they don't have as much PR and, you know, glam and glitz behind them. Do I think honeybees are bad? No, I think they're great. They'll do themselves in. Like, they do a good job of like hive collapse and dying and all that stuff. And if anyone here is in this panel or in the participants here has ever kept bees, know that it's like one of the hardest pets to keep alive. So, and expensive, but yeah, I say like protect all bees, like all pollinators, and honeybees are just a very small component of that. So I think they just have like a good PR behind them.
There you go. Jimmy Gatt said 80% of bees are solitary bees that lay their eggs in holes in bare soil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we have a very robust, I mean, and people don't realize that some of our native bees are like this big. Like sweat bees are tiny.
Mm-hmm. And
they're green. They're not, you know, black and yellow like you think of when you think of a bee. We're black and orange. What are like a bumblebee colors?
Like black and yellow?
Yeah.
All right, so next question. Leads on financial incentives / funding for these restorative projects on a public scale as well as private scale.
Gosh, I wish I had a good answer for that. There aren't many at the moment, but the climate is really changing as far as what types of larger projects are coming down the pipeline. And just as far as like the way our government administration is starting to think about how to incentivize these types of things, because it's becoming more of a priority. So I would say be on the lookout, but I don't know of any specifically in Atlanta. I bet Jamie does.
I can say this is naughty of me, but Commissioner Ted Terry, I can give you his information to his office, and you guys can write him and say, we want to see more regenerative, restorative agriculture or landscaping in our communities.
Yeah.
And I found out something really interesting, that it only takes like 5 to 10 people calling the office consistently or leaving an email to really get stuff done, because DeKalb County works based on like the squeaky wheel gets the oil kind of thing.
Wow.
I'm learning the ropes. So yeah, for those of you who want, you know, Commissioner Ted Terry's information, I will give it over to you. You guys can email him directly and request that you would like to see more programs, especially on the roadsides where they're really blighted and they have a lot of invasives. You'd want to see those kind of restored back, or I don't want to use the word restored. What's the other word you used?
Regenerated.
Regenerated back to something that could be used for more better human and you know, animal and people use. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, the next one's a little bit long. How can we spread the healing properties of many of these species while simultaneously making efforts to remove them? Given the upwards trend of herbal medicine, will the at times selfish nature of the human want to perpetuate the spread of these species in the U.S., even though they are destructive to natural habitats? Will a time come to choose between the healing of humans versus the healing of nature? Should we instead look towards native herbal medicine?
I love this question. Thank you. Well, I think if we're really talking about the relationship with the earth, I don't think healing nature versus healing humans is separate at all. One of my friends who's on this call mentioned some, Japanese knotweed is known to treat Lyme disease, and it also then populates areas with lots of ticks. Nature is smarter than we think it is, than she is. So I think there's a way in which the season cycle, that climate change even cycles and brings us the medicine we need right when we need it. And so I don't think particularly that there is a dichotomy there. I do think if your question is talking a little bit to the nature of human greed, that is something always to consider, which is why I'm an advocate of invasive species medicine, because it's a little more greed proof, or perhaps it allows us to transform greed into something productive, which is a gift in the world that we live in now. To get on my soapbox for a second, if we can channel this grief into someone funding a removal of privet from a large swath of land, like, cool, take all the privet medicine you want. So I am open reading your question again. I think knowledge is the way to spread the healing property, because in order to really spread that property while removing it, you need to know when. Because like with privet in Chinese medicine, you use the berries, and so that's only available certain types of the year. Yeah, I just got really excited. I think that answers your question.
Sam, there's a similar relationship between stinging nettle and jewelweed, which are both native. The jewelweed tends to grow where stinging nettle grows, and it happens to be the antidote to the sting of the nettle.
Yeah, and jewelweed's pretty good for poison ivy as well.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah. And even things in like indigenous agriculture, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, things grow in a way in which they're already in right relationship with each other. It's us as humans that have kind of come in and disturbed these relationships that exist in balance. And so if we're doing this regeneration, I use the wrong one, that we're restoring that.
No, it's regeneration.
Okay, I got nervous.
You're right. The second part of your question, where you're asking about the perpetuation of the spread of these species, even though they're destructive, I think that's where legislation comes into play. I do think that, as much as I like to believe in human beings' better natures, I do think that punishment is a really big incentive for changing an entire cultural mindset about a thing. So if there are no consequences for doing the bad thing, people will continue to do the bad thing. This is what we have seen in the past, in history. So just making these priorities known so that people have that power is really important.
Not to diminish also in that question the importance of native herbal medicine and using what grows well here. That is awesome and exceptional. And I think particularly this year, as we've been taught about the supply chain and how infrastructure is so related to everything that we need and accessing things, native medicine is a really productive way forward. So I also don't want to ignore that aspect of the question.
All right, we have one left here. Can you touch on the difference between a rain garden and a pollinator garden?
Sure. A rain garden is constructed with the purpose of re-infiltrating water back into the water table. And a pollinator garden is constructed with the goal of providing more food, usually food, but sometimes habitat too. And if you're doing like a really good pollinator garden, you're providing plants that your pollinators can live their whole life cycle on, so that you can actually increase the population of those species. Now, there's usually crossover between rain gardens and pollinator gardens. Usually your rain gardens are going to have pollinator plants, but not every pollinator garden is a rain garden, and not every garden is a pollinator garden.
Great explanation. Thank you. That was awesome.
Sure.
All right, I think that's all the questions that we have.
I have a question for the two panelists. So what is striking the balance look like? And this is, this kind of like talks a little bit about my work. I love to see landscapes that we connect to. And I think I've always thought that the connection piece is like, if a kid, or even an adult, we're all like big kids, right? If we can pick an apple off a tree or pick a berry off a bush in our everyday landscape when we pass by, something that's really palatable. And I'm not talking like medicine that you got to crush or make, just readily available calories, right? What is striking the balance look like within our landscapes? Like, I know like we all got to eat. We are fighting massive, like this pandemic has like really unveiled a lot of like food insecurity issues in our community. So and I get we got to fight both. You know, we got to fight both climate change and food insecurity. And so what does that balance look like to the both of you in creating our landscapes? Like, is it okay to plant a banana tree somewhere? Is it okay to plant an apple or a berry or like a, you know, something that doesn't, like an olive, like one of those olives? What does the balance look like?
So just because something is non-native does not mean it's invasive. Also, I don't know if I had clarified that in my definition. Invasive, again, for the purposes of this talk, refers specifically to plants that are displacing habitat. There are lots of edible and agricultural plants that don't do that at all. Like you can essentially plant, most fruit trees will not reproduce, will not self-perpetuate. So you can pretty easily and safely put them, especially like in those areas that you like to call zone 1, Jamie, those areas that are heavy human usage, and we're really thinking about a human perspective rather than like what is needed for a more heavy habitat space, a more wilded area. There's lots of room to just ameliorate those spaces, and especially when you're working with areas that have nothing, like lawn. Honestly, in those areas, anything is better. Anything is better than nothing. Anything that you put in that area is going to have some sort of infrastructural value for the ecology. Sam, what do you think?
My instinct as an anthropology student is to draw that back a little and take maybe away from the banana, but just the idea that balance is struck when we believe that we also have something to offer. So much about this language that we've talked about is like, yes, humans are responsible and hold a lot of the agency for the damage here, but also we steward the land and bring things about. Like T mentioned, when we talk about native and what this nation looked like pre-human activity, we just mean pre-white Western destruction primarily. So I think the way in which we've been approaching conservation in the past is that from guilt, like we're acting based off of this negative emotion that everything we bring to the earth is wrong and bad. And then we can find the balance if we also acknowledge that my human cultivation of the soil is giving the earth something. I am tending it, offering it, ameliorating the soil and things of that nature. So balance comes from the reciprocity in this cycle. And I think, so yes, while maybe a banana tree may not be what is marketed as something good and native for the soil, the fact that you are loving and putting energy into the ground is striking that balance.
Good answers. Thank you, guys. I just wanted to ask that question. Curious.
Okay, so Sam has asked me to allow Danielle to come on and talk about something that she has going on, I think.
If she wants.
What up, Danielle?
If not, I'll just talk about it if I can find the slide.
I think it's at the end. After this.
Okay, now can you hear me? Then I took you off my Bluetooth.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I was doing a workout while I was listening to you guys. Okay, so really quick, I have so many things to say, but I'll really just limit it to what the work I'm doing. 2 years ago, I was listening to Dr. Drew Lanham, who is a professor at Clemson, talk about his experience leading a group of refugee students from Sudan on an environmental education program. And they were learning about all the things you guys just heard Sam and T talking about invasive species. And they were horrified because the language that the educator was using was similar to the language used to talk about them. And while plants and animals and fungus and whatever else are not, the words still are triggering. And so I spent 2 years casually looking into how to change my language and how I taught invasive species, and then more intensively the past several months. And so I started a conversation series looking at the actual dialogue and language we use, and that turned into also looking at our perspectives on invasive species. So if anyone is interested in that, you can join us. There's a graphic on the screen, but you're welcome to join that discussion. I'll put my email in the chat as well if anyone wants direct links. And I'll also put the link because we have the previous conversation recorded and on our on my partner's website, partner in this, not partner in life. But anyway, I'll share that all in the chat if anyone is interested in learning more about that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. So,
And thank you for, sorry, I should just say thank you for letting me share this information with everyone.
Sure. So I think somebody went in and answered that last question. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it off because we have gone quite a bit over time. But I wanted to thank you guys for coming on and talking, and feel free to reach out to these guys if anybody on here has any other questions. All right. Thanks for attending.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone. I want to make sure that as 3 white folks leading this panel, that the last question that was asked about the experiences of people of color is not just like thrown aside because we're running out of time.
What was the last question?
It was about how we talked about this. I won't paraphrase, I'll pull it back up. How marginalized communities affected by invasive species, so removal of these species impact them or not, specifically indigenous, people of color, and Black folks. I tried to start answering it because I was like, oh, we're running out of time. But,
there's a lot to answer there.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, and I want to mention that that's a big reason why the 3 people leading this conversation right now are white people, is because we're taught that environmentalism is a thing of whiteness, privilege, how we experience nature recreationally. Ooh, I'm getting slow down. All things that we're taught are the experience of white folks. And when I tried to dabble in with this answer, as I think the way we unpack the language we use around invasives really immediately relates to the white savior complex. Like, ooh, we did a bad, let's fix it. And then we're still in the position of power. We being white people here. We have the solutions and also the brain, the agency, so much of that. And then we can leave the workday feeling great because we saved the earth, So I think that is a huge reason why more people of color, Black and indigenous folks aren't in this conversation. This literal one, because obviously people have been talking about this for eons, and often people of color and indigenous folks and Black folks are having more conversations and relating better to nature than the white culture perpetuates. So I just wanted to make sure we address that out loud and not ignore that, particularly based off of who's leading this conversation.
Sam, thank you for making that point that for us to discuss this, because it is really important. And most of who is going to bear the brunt of the impacts of what happens when our green and ecological infrastructure starts to fail because of things like invasive species. And invasive species aren't the only problem. Pollution is a huge problem. Where we see these to be the most problem are in disenfranchised communities, are in marginalized communities. So it's the rich and powerful white people have come along and caused the problem. And then they also want to come in, like we're doing, and propose the solutions. And marginalized communities get cut out of the conversation a lot, which is why I love Wawa so much, because really they're a Black-run organization that is doing incredible work on the west side of Atlanta to clean up that whole watershed. Yes, I would love to have more of this conversation too. I'm seeing your responses to the question now. So it really, again, it goes back to what we were saying about being able to have these conversations in a way that people can hear what you're saying because you're meeting them where they're at, instead of just coming in and being like, hey, I have a solution to your problem that you didn't know you had.
Exactly. So, and then also one thing that's coming So I talk about this for hours. Come into my mind also, speaking of privilege and systems around invasive species, a lot of times in urban complexes, unhoused people are living in these swaths of invasive species.
Yes.
So when we go in and clean up the neighborhood, we're displacing people as well as the ecosystem. So that's also, this conversation gone for hours. I'm so jazzed.
I had a friend who was doing GIS work, noting where the different endemic species were at South Bend Park, and they disclosed to me that like one of the biggest difficulties of doing that work was just like navigating the unhoused encampments and not, you know, trying to respect people's privacy as they're walking through this wooded area, and like even having that conversation, which wasn't ever thought of by the higher ups who sent my friend out there to begin with. You know, it never even occurred to them that there would be people living in the forest there and that might be a disruption. So, you know, we all need to educate ourselves on like what is actually happening at the ground level in our neighborhoods and surrounding areas with the people, not just with the space.
Awesome. I know we didn't even really begin to answer that question.
Thank you for grabbing it though, Sam. I appreciate that. I just saw that there was one there, so I'm glad that you brought attention to that. Awesome. All right, well, if you guys don't have anything else, I'm gonna go ahead and end it here.
Thank you, Ashley. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks, team.
Awesome conversation.
Everyone.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.